Right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. We won't turn the camera on. So last week we had a seminar from the Energy Systems Catapult, and we heard from Tom Luff. And one of the key features of his talk was this idea about locational energy pricing, recognizing that energy is worth different amounts depending on where you are in the country. Part of that was to do with transmission constraints and lack of local generating capacity. So I think what's going to be interesting today is that we've got Jack Atkins from Regen to come and talk about, well, actually, we should think about where we put the generating assets, particularly if they're connected with wind, because there's a distribution to wind around the UK, and actually you might want some diversity of generation. So you don't need to do the talk now. So Jack's background in data analytics and engineering within the energy industry, and you spent over a decade there, and I know you've worked with marine current turbines. And I didn't know CIMIC, Atlantis Energy. So was that a merger or?
So Atlantis existed prior or sort of concurrently, and then marine current turbines ended up sort of being bought by Atlantis. So we sort of merged into a dream team of tidal energy people.
And Jack helped commission one of these pioneering tidal stream turbines, and but also you got fluid dynamics background, so you've helped DNV with some of the software that helps with is that more wind energy rather than?
It's sort of primarily a wind turbine simulation piece of software, but it's also actually used, and that was kind of why it was a neat transfer for me, because it's also used in the tidal industry because the physics is very similar apart from the
just slightly denser medium going past. And Jack, you're currently senior analyst at Regen, is that right?
That's a new role for me, or relatively new. I started in April last year, so I'll talk a bit about that.
And then if we look back in Jack's past, he did his undergrad in maths right here. So welcome back, Jack.
Nice to be back.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin. Cheers. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming this afternoon. Just unlock my laptop. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that we completed in October of last year, focusing on the sort of distributional aspects of offshore wind around the UK. But I'll start off, first of all, just with a quick introduction about Regen for those who perhaps don't know what Regen is as an organisation. So we're an independent, not-for-profit centre of energy expertise with a mission to accelerate the transition to a zero-carbon energy system. We do that by addressing the changes needed in policy, markets and regulation to achieve net zero emissions by looking systemically across power, heat and transport. We undertake quite a wide range of work, really, anywhere we feel that there are challenges or barriers on the pathway to net zero, and where we feel that we can intervene and address those barriers. That might range from problems in trying to access the grid or a lack of diversity in the sector, or to the role of local players and local authorities. But all of the activities that we undertake have this sort of golden thread running through, which is about the decarbonisation of the energy system. We're also a membership organisation, and we manage the electricity storage network, which is the voice of the UK storage industry. Overall, we've got 150 members who share our mission, including clean energy developers, businesses, local authorities, community energy groups, academic institutions, and research organisations across the energy sector. And I've had a really interesting time since joining the organisation in October last year, working across a number of different projects. These have included my first project, which was looking at the capability and opportunity for clean maritime propulsion in the UK, sort of particularly focused on the southwest. I've also worked on analysing how the demands on SSEN's licence area distribution networks from how the demands from energy generation, demand and storage are likely to change over the next decade and out to 2050. So that's known as the Distribution Future Energy Scenarios, or DFES. And then Go West, which is probably my most enjoyable project today, which is what I'm here to speak to you guys about today. Just do the, hopefully that's got it, yeah. So there's been significant advancements in offshore wind generation in recent years. In the first 3 months of this year alone, a third of the country's electricity came from wind farms. And in terms of targets that we have as a country, the UK is targeting 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and a decarbonised power system by 2035. The National Grid's Future Energy Scenarios Consumer Transformation Scenario projects an almost 9 times increase in offshore wind capacity, up to 110 gigawatts by 2050, which would provide 56% of total domestic generation. So we know that increasing offshore wind generation capacity is vital, but there are really important considerations such as where should we be putting these wind turbines? What's the most optimal distribution for the energy system? And in terms of going about doing that, how do we enable a rapid but coordinated development of an optimal offshore wind fleet? And that's basically what this project is about. So GOES, as I say, was released in October of last year and was sponsored by 4 offshore wind developers, Simply Blue, Northland Power, Moorwind and Magnora Offshore Wind. Whilst we, as Regen, we retained editorial independence, as independence is quite important for us as an organisation. Since the report has been produced, it's been cited in a couple of significant reports. So the Seizing Our Opportunities report by the offshore wind champion, Tim Pick. That's the one on the left there. So Tim Pick was the government's offshore wind champion, and also it's been featured in the Delivering a Reliable Decarbonised Power System report by the Climate Change Committee. Both of these sort of drew out a couple of really important points to the motivation, and these are the kind of things that I'm trying to hook you on and get your interest in. Sort of these are the questions, the ideas that we're trying to engage with in this report. So Tim Pick, the offshore wind champion, picked up on this idea: who in the UK institutional framework is responsible for systems thinking and asking questions about where are the offshore wind farm sites optimal from a wider energy system reliability and resilience perspective. And then the CCC picked up on the benefits that we found in the report, which was the idea that if we do have a more distributed offshore wind fleet, that will give us more consistency, reduce variability of total available GB generation. And perhaps most importantly, you kind of think when you're hedging your bets by having a more distributed offshore wind fleet that there might be an impact on yield, but our kind of analysis that showed that there wasn't a significant or any real reduction in total energy generation yield per year. So basically very compelling from what we found with our results. So now I'll just move on to the structure of today's talk. So we'll start off looking at our motivations for the report and its kind of inception. I'll run through the methodology of the report and some of the way that we process all the results and gained a lot of the data for it. And then I'll talk through both the results and the energy system benefits of having a more distributed offshore wind fleet. And then at the end, we'll have a quick look at perhaps some of the policy implications of what we'd need to do to try and ensure that this system manifests. So in terms of motivation, I thought I'd start with sort of my personal motivation, which goes back to, as Robin mentioned, my sort of background in tidal energy. So I joined Marine Current Turbines, who are responsible for this device here, which is like a twin rotor tidal stream turbine. That crossbeam that you can see there with the 2 rotors is lower down into the water, and its peak power is 1.2 megawatts. And it's basically the most pioneering tidal energy device. Unfortunately, I had no part in its kind of design or commissioning, but I sort of arrived after that. But I arrived there in 2013 at a time where it felt like there was a lot of momentum in the industry. MCT had just been bought by Siemens, and there were other sort of competitor companies who had also been picked up by large corporates. It felt like there was a lot of velocity in what was happening in the industry. And at that time, the industry was supported by renewable obligation certificates, or the ROC scheme, which was in essence you're paid a certain subsidy per unit of energy that you're generated. And that's me looking very jolly on my visit to CGen. Very useful as well. And then later on, so the interest started to wane from Siemens, I think at the time, because they weren't prepared, I think, for the sort of level of investment that would be required to really take the industry from what was a commercial scale demonstrator model into a fully commercial business. And so there was a slight struggle for us as a company. We ended up being bought by a competitor who was Atlantis. And then together we sort of joined late in the development process of their AR1500 turbine, which is a 1.5 megawatt, which was commissioned in 2017. Kind of around that time, it was actually in 2015, there was a shift in the way that the government was supporting the industry. What ended up happening is they introduced a new mechanism, so the contracts for difference mechanism in 2015, which changed the way that subsidy was kind of given out to companies in the industry. think, yeah, which led to this scenario that you can see here. There started to be quite a crisis moment for the industry just by virtue of the fact that the government had changed this mechanism, which had a really significant impact. So I'll do a quick wander through what the CFD is in case people aren't aware of it. So as I say, ROCs was essentially you kind of, for every unit of energy you generate, you would get a certain amount of money. And I think the more innovative or the more novel the technology was, so Tidal would get what you would call like 5 ROCs. So it would be 5 certificates for every unit of energy generated, and that would, you would get a price per certificate, so you get quite a lot of money with that. What the government did is they've changed this scheme, which still continues to this day, which is the contract of difference scheme. So in effect, if you're successful in the process, you will win a contract which guarantees you a certain strike price, we call it, which is a guaranteed electricity price for 15 years. It's a 15-year contract. And in essence, what that guarantee is that if the reference price, so the kind of electricity wholesale price, if that ever dips below that strike price, the government will top up the difference. That's quite important because it's not a fixed amount of money that the government's giving you. It's just giving you the top up to kind of guarantee you that strike price. The sort of kickback for the consumer and for the country is that if the wholesale price goes over that strike price, the excess is then paid back from the generator back to the government. So it's a two-way transaction. It's not a one-way kind of subsidy just for the consumer. The impact really in a switch to this system was more in the way that this there we go. Yeah, the impact is more about how those contracts are kind of competed for and handed out. So this, in essence, is showing you the sort of the structure of the auction. What happens is that you have a budget per year in a particular round. So you can see that year on year, the government sort of allocated an increasing amount of budget to go to these schemes, these renewable energy schemes. And what happens is that all the companies in a particular round will compete to try and bid for the lowest amount or the lowest strike price from the government. So in essence, trying to bid for the lowest level of support from the government. Those who are cheapest will go in first, and then they kind of stack all of the bids up until their budget in a particular delivery year has been maxed out. And at that point, whichever the most expensive strike price is in a particular year, everyone who's successful will also gain that same strike price. The important element to this is the fact that the way that the government divided the pot, so they had a kind of more mature technology pot and a less mature technology pot. And so Tidal was put into a category with offshore wind. Offshore wind was a lot cheaper than Tidal, and Tidal basically was kind of beaten hands down by offshore wind. So it's gone from kind of having quite consistent subsidy or having a scheme which would allow for sort of new technologies being developed, to all of a sudden sort of being thrust into the Colosseum against offshore wind, having absolutely no chance losing its subsidy. This is quite a long meandering way of basically saying at this point, it made me realise how important, as an engineer, up to that point, thinking that engineering was kind of what the sort of success or failure of the project was all about. And then I realised actually probably at least half of the importance of, or half of the impact of whether we are successful or not is down to what the government's doing in terms of its policy. And that for me, on a personal level, is why I moved to Regen a year ago, and also why I think these kind of projects, when we're thinking about the development of offshore wind in the UK, we should be thinking about how are we going to do this and not just allowing the market to kind of battle it out and go for cheapest price. There's a much bigger game to play, which is delivering capacity and delivering an energy system that is sort of constructed in a really optimal way. So thinking more broadly about kind of wind energy, it's been in the news a fair few times in the last few years. So we've got a few mentions in there. There's a mention of like the balancing mechanism price jumping to high levels of £4,000 a megawatt hour when we've had a combination of low wind and other renewable energy generation. And then obviously particularly being called out in terms of low amounts of wind as well. So you've got the mention there, lack of wind sparks new fears over green energy revolution. And then SSE saying that low wind and driest conditions in 70 years has hit renewable generation. So we're seeing these kind of issues occur, and it should be making us think, well, are we going about our kind of construction of the energy system with regards to offshore wind? Are we doing that in an optimal way that's trying to minimize these problems? So deployment of the offshore wind fleet to date has been focused in the southern North Sea, and that's almost 3/4 of the UK's offshore wind capacity. We've arrived at a time now where historically deploying offshore wind off the west coast has been particularly hard. It's a very different kind of bathymetry to what we see in the North Sea. But now we kind of have the development and maturity of floating wind technology, which means that projects in the west have now got a new opportunity. And historically, we've seen about 8 gigawatts of projects cancelled or withdrawn, but we're not going to see the development of offshore wind on the west coast and north coast of Scotland. We're not going to see that happen by itself. We need to make sure that the government's stimulating the industry in the right way. So that means we've got an opportunity for west coast offshore wind projects to address the lack of geographical diversity of the UK's offshore wind fleet and to play a vital role in energy system balancing, energy security, and price stability. So this is a slide looking at complementary resource. And the thing to focus on, so these are each of the lines we're looking at Celtic Sea in sort of a yellow colour, yellow-green, Southern North Sea, I'm red-green colourblind, so you have to excuse my description of colours, but sort of a dark blue for Southern North Sea and then red north of Scotland. And the thing to focus on is what we're looking at is 3 kind of points around the UK and the complementarity of the resource in the different areas. So at times you'll see all 3 sort of move to a high or low resource together, but there are particular periods, as you can see highlighted here, where in this case we've got a low on the left-hand side, the highlighted area on the left, a low but increasing capacity factor in the North Sea and Celtic Sea. And on the right-hand side, we've got a low capacity factor in the southern North Sea, but higher in Celtic Sea and north of Scotland. Just sort of illustrating that with a quick animation here. I'll step through these slides. Sort of, to me, it's slightly reminiscent of like a 3-phase kind of generator or something, seeing these energy sources sort of move in and out. So we're starting off, all 3 are kind of roughly about the same level in terms of generation. And then we see this drop off in north of Scotland, moving into a higher pressure area. But then north of Scotland starts to peak, whilst we see Celtic Sea and southern North Sea start to dip off. And we move to this point here as the weather systems move through. You can see here, this is a period of time where the southern North Sea has got low wind resource, and in the Celtic Sea as well, but north of Scotland would be a good complement to that. And now here we're seeing kind of Celtic Sea increase in power, just as the north of Scotland starting to tail off, and then following that, sort of in that way I was describing, kind of with the 3-phase generator, the southern North Sea starting to increase. And you just get these moments where the inception of the whole project came from our director, Johnny Gowley, who was talking about seeing the weather systems one weekend where it was particularly low in the North Sea, and seeing there wasn't much offshore wind generation, but noticing at the same time that other parts of the country had great wind resource, and why aren't we trying to capture those at the same time? I think fundamentally it's like an incredibly intuitive idea. It's just, you know, this project, we're trying to give some numbers and some more motivation to that idea, really. So it's nothing complex. So yeah, moving on to the methodology now. I'll just skip that one. So there's effectively 4 steps to the methodology that we took. So we discretized the area around the UK into different zones, and we looked at changing the capacity of offshore wind generation in those different zones, and used that as a means of playing with the distribution of offshore wind around the UK. We took some wind power data from a really good online resource called Renewables Ninja, which is created by a couple of guys at Imperial College. And if you're interested in sort of doing studies into wind power generation, I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at that. It's a fantastic resource. Makes people like makes my life and, you know, people in similar roles easier by just having this kind of thing on tap. And then we created sort of 3 primary scenarios, which was looking at the distribution of where the offshore wind fleet could be around the UK in years to come, and seeing what the impact of that is, and then obviously the results of that. In terms of the zoning, it's discretized based on wind resource, the deployment of wind generators that are currently operational in construction or planned, and then looking at other factors like leasing round bidding areas, Crown Estate key resource areas, and bathymetry as well. So having a distinction between near and further offshore areas. And then in terms of the results, we're sort of looking at key metrics like total time spent at very high or very low power, which is what this one's obviously highlighting, the number of occurrences, and then the variability of power generation and total annual yields, as I mentioned earlier. So this is just a quick highlighting of the resource that we used. It's Renewables Ninja. It's fantastically simple to use. You effectively can put a pin in a map anywhere, and it will use kind of NASA meteorological data to kind of interpolate to that particular spot, and you can use different characteristics. So it's got, now it looks like over 20 years worth of data. I think it goes back to 2000 kind of onwards. And you can define basically like a capacity of a wind farm is what it's modeling really, a hub height, and then you can define like a particular turbine model, and from that it will use the power curve, and then it just spits out like a year's worth of data. And you can obviously do that for repeated years. So for this study, we basically put a dot in the center of each of those kind of zones that I showed in the previous slide here, where those red dots are in each of the zones. We put a pin in each of those, and then just change the capacity for each of the scenarios that we were looking at to see how that affected generation from the energy system perspective. So these are the scenarios that we were looking at. Each of these are based on a 70 gigawatt installed capacity that was constant across all of the scenarios. And as I say, it was 20 years worth of data at 1 hour's resolution. And the broad idea that we're getting at here, the visuals here are just to simplify. As I say, there was still about 23 different zones, but we've just kind of aggregated them to make it easier to look at. So we're starting with the stay east scenario, which is broadly where we're kind of at the moment, where we're predominantly much of our offshore wind resources on the east coast, and then moving through to lean west and then go west, where go west is sort of much more sort of 50-50 between east and west coast, and thinking about that more distributed offshore wind fleet. 70 gigawatt might seem like a slightly random number. We picked it. We were thinking about sort of selecting a year initially and talking about what the offshore wind fleet should look like in a certain year, but there were kind of discussions around, or certainly some disputes around, what level of offshore wind capacity we might actually achieve by a particular year, and we wanted to avoid that kind of controversy, so we just stuck with a capacity rather than thinking about a particular year. And 70 gigawatts is quite a good kind of milestone on the way. You can see these are the National Grid energy system operators future energy scenarios. So the three coloured ones are the primary ones. The falling short is a scenario that we don't really want to be in. The other three sort of vary according to their deployment of different technologies. The one that we think is probably best is the consumer transformation one, so the yellow one. And we see 70 gigawatts as being like a milestone on the way to deploying what could be between 90 and 110 gigawatts. And then the sort of final step of our analysis was thinking about the system impacts. So we created a simple model of dispatch of the GB electricity system. It included a representative generation fleet demand profile and some of the flexibility options. We use that to give an indication of action of flexibility and the utilization of dispatchable power stations. And then that informed outcomes on system balancing and carbon emissions. Ultimately, what you're doing is we were sort of defining a certain level of capacity for each of the different generation technologies, defining a certain price based on primarily kind of information from department, or the BEIS department, and then dispatching technologies on a cost basis effectively. So working from cheapest, which tends to be based on the marginal price. So renewables being the cheapest because their marginal price is zero effectively, and then going up through the more expensive marginal price technologies and coincidentally more polluting. So it's a quick whiz through the methodology. So thinking about the results and the energy system benefits. So we don't take it all in because it's quite a lot. We identified quite a number of benefits here. These three kind of pink blobs in the middle are the main categories that we think about. So we've got geographical diversity of generation. We've got the reduction in generation peaks and troughs, and then volatility reduction. So for the geographical diversity of generation, that's thinking about improving system resilience and reducing capacity margins and capacity factors. And it should result in reduced network investment and flexibility costs. The reduction in the periods of very low generation means an increased utilization of renewable energy and merit order effects. And then lower generation volatility, which includes reduced ramp rates, which I'll explain, leads to reduced system balancing and operability costs. It reduces market risk and wholesale price volatility. So we'll dip into a bit of each of these. We'll look at some simpler and nicer graphs. So the first thing to say is that everything I'm about to tell you in terms of the results is not about yield. So there's no comparison here on a yield basis about which one's better or worse. They're all pretty much the same. What's more important is about the when and the where of our generation. So this slide's looking at the number of events, as we've called it, per year. So we're defining an event as a discrete occurrence per year where the offshore wind fleet is generating at a very high or a very low level. And that's defined by the capacity factor. So very low power is where the entire offshore wind fleet is below 10% capacity factor. And then high power is obviously above 80%. You can see with the very low power, so stay east, we have 31 events per year on average of very low power. That gets reduced by around 3/4 in the go west scenario. And we see a slight reduction in the number of events of very high power above 80% capacity factor. But that could have positive benefits in terms of the reduction of curtailment events, basically. This one is, try and skim through this one quickly. What I'm trying to illustrate here is these again are from the National Grid future energy scenarios, and this is the stack in 2050 of what they project all of the generation technologies to be. What I've done here is to just change the numbers. So I've taken our kind of 100% offshore wind capacity and I've reduced it to 10% as an example of what the generation stack might look like. Obviously, you need to consider as well that we've got other renewables technologies in there. So we've got onshore wind and solar. And when you consider that, solar is kind of averaging about 10% and onshore wind maybe about 30% or something, it's bringing that peak much closer to this sort of peak system demand here. So this is trying to give context to thinking around the troughs and peaks in generation. Obviously, we want to avoid very low generation. We want to make sure that we have enough capacity here, and ideally, we'd have an offshore wind fleet which is much more consistent to keep us away from getting too close to where our peak demand is, having enough cushion above that. Equally, if we were to think about kind of closer to 90%, so having a big buffer there, generation is likely going to be much larger than what our peak demand is. And in that case, we won't really be able to do anything with it. I guess we'll be able to absorb some of it into storage. But essentially, there's not much value in having curtailed energy. We want generation that doesn't really go too high and doesn't go too low. And curtailment has a cost implication in the balancing mechanism. But at the same time, once a wind turbine is built, it costs almost nothing to generate. So it's a waste to not use that energy. At the same time, as we think about optimizing the energy system, some curtailment will be inevitable, and it's the price we pay for having sufficient energy for most of the time. But we want to minimize curtailment as best we can, and that's why we think the distribution of offshore wind needs to be considered carefully. In conjunction with this idea, in terms of the number of discrete events, we should be thinking about the duration of those events as well. So this is the maximum event duration where offshore wind is below 10% capacity. And this is the maximum duration with the 20 years of data that we've got. So you can see there's quite a significant reduction in a system where your offshore wind fleet is primarily East Coast focused. There's an almost halving of the maximum event duration if we have a much more distributed offshore wind system. The significance of that is that it has implications for the use of storage. So if we reduce the duration of very low wind power generation, it makes it more feasible to use pump storage or battery storage or EV storage. This is thinking about volatility. So volatility is obviously the magnitude of the fluctuation in your kind of power generation profile. So on the left-hand side, the fluctuation of power in 1 year, that's the average of the highest annual ramp rate, as we call it, the ramp rate being the fluctuation in energy generation from 1 hour to the next. It could be positive or negative, and we've just looked at the magnitude here. And so you can see, again, if we move from a primarily East Coast based offshore wind fleet, we almost halve that maximum level of volatility per year by moving to a more distributed offshore wind fleet. And then this is just the average volatility. So it's taking all 20 years of data and calculating the magnitude of change from 1 hour to the next. So there's obviously a reduction from 1 hour to the next. Fundamentally, this is a really good thing, because the more volatility you have in your energy generation, the more difficult it is to meet demand. You want something that's much more controllable, predictable, and less volatile. That will suit us much better in terms of meeting the demand profile that we have. And that can be thought about in two ways. So if we have a really volatile kind of offshore wind generation profile, if there's a sudden increase in the level of wind, there's a risk that if we don't have good systems in place, we're just going to have to curtail that wind. So if the ESO can't get other power stations to turn down sufficiently quickly, then we'll have to instruct wind generation not to increase power output at the rate that it could do, and rely on more predictable forms of power, which are likely to be fossil fuel dispatchable generation. If there's a risk that wind is going to drop off very quickly, and more quickly than we can bring power stations online, then we'd have to turn offshore wind off in advance effectively and bring those more predictable forms of power online earlier, instead of being able to control how quickly we turn the wind fleet down or off. The implications for that is that we would have to have more power stations on standby, ready and warm. So there's a cost implication for that, obviously, as we've experienced with gas prices recently. But we'd also have the cost implications of having them warm and idle and not actually delivering power, as well as the emissions implications of having gas and coal power stations ready to go. Move on here. So this is thinking about the amount of time at high and low power. So this is we've got a broad category here of kind of mid power generation, which is probably the best place we want to be, not too, trying to not be too volatile and move to the extremes too much. And in effect, by moving, I think it's quite an intuitive idea. If we have a more distributed offshore wind fleet and we're hedging our bets, then we're just squeezing that distribution. I think it's slightly more clearer here. So that dark line, which is primarily East Coast focused, we're kind of squeezing that inwards. So we're reducing the time at low power by moving to a go west scenario, and then squeezing that in so more time is sort of spent in this mid power range, which is much better for predictability and being able to control and match our demand. So thinking about the benefits of geographical diversity of generation, one of the benefits is thinking about the transmission network. So by spreading our wind fleet more widely, it puts less pressure on any one part of the transmission network. And I think one of the difficulties we experience now with our infrastructure is that we have bottlenecks in certain part of the network. So by having a more distributed offshore wind fleet, we're kind of getting around those bottlenecks. I should say that we didn't actually consider transmission constraint within this study here. We kind of assumed that all generation was dispatchable and able to meet demand, but that wasn't the point of the study. We were sort of focused on generation availability, but I could imagine that a good next step for the project would be to start to introduce that kind of network constraint. I think another element as well of the geographical diversity is thinking about forecast risk and market forecast risk, so we can be more confident of our output if our assets are more spread around rather than all being in one place. If we kind of have a forecast area of a particular region around the UK and all of our assets are there, it's quite a significant area. And whereas more distributed, that kind of area is divided more between different generation assets. And then inevitably, if we're thinking about developing an offshore wind fleet around more parts of the country, that has like an economic benefit in terms of spreading the development around the country, being less reliant as we are at the moment on just development kind of on the East Coast. We can spread that to other parts of the country. This is kind of backed up by, this is a study, it's the Growing Clean report for the Economy 2030 inquiry. And it's basically showing that offshore wind is kind of over here on the far right. So it's showing that we've got quite significant returns within a particular region of the country, wherever you choose to develop the offshore wind. The vertical axis here is returns in other areas of the country, other regions. So it's showing that wherever you invest in offshore wind, it's a good return within that area, but not so much spillover into other areas. So it's showing that if we are developing kind of more broadly around the country, then that's a good way to sort of distribute some of the benefits of that system around the country rather than expecting it to just sort of be spread by osmosis effectively. And then reduction in generation peaks and troughs. We found that there was a 17% reduction in the average marginal cost of generation. And that was by reduced utilization of like higher cost and higher carbon fossil fuels, which will come onto on the next slide. And we found as well that reduced peaks and troughs meant that there was a reduction in the grid carbon intensity, again, by reduced use of fossil fuel generations. So that's the reduction in marginal cost. This is kind of looking at the marginal generation cost curve. So here we're starting off with our, sorry, some of the words got a bit split over the line. Here we're starting off with cheaper and generally lower kind of lower emitting technologies, and it's showing that showing the relationship between once you've dispatched all of your renewable generation and you're having to make up a bigger and bigger deficit here. This is looking at your cumulative marginal cost. So there's kind of like a non-linear relationship. And so if we can try and minimize the amount at any one time that we're having to dip into non-renewable technologies, it has quite a considerable impact upon cost and emissions by keeping it upon this part of the curve. If we have any occasions where we have a massive deficit between what we've generated with renewable technologies and then having to go into, as I say here, CCGT, OCGT and hydrogen, it really kind of ramps up in terms of emissions and in cost as well. And then this was quite an interesting result because, so again, here we're not thinking about, well, we're thinking about, because our study is looking at a fixed kind of capacity of offshore wind, it's not about building more in order to reduce cost or building more to reduce carbon intensity. It's simply about where we put it can have a significant impact on these factors. So here, just by redistributing the same capacity of offshore wind, we can have quite a significant reduction in grid carbon intensity. And our sort of simple dispatch model said that it would kind of put it close to what the Climate Change Committee's target for grid carbon intensity was. And then the third sort of major element was volatility reduction. So volatility reduction means that we've got improved operability and stability of energy generation, whereas higher volatility increases the overall system costs by increasing the need for balancing market intervention, making sure that any kind of rapid change in generation is met elsewhere. If there's a sudden dip, that we have to suddenly complement that with other sources of generation. And also it increases market price risk for energy traders and supply company by it being less predictable and more volatile. So the final element, just thinking about the policy implications of this report. So the three primary recommendations we made were, firstly, thinking about an integrated plan and a strategic approach. I think this one really surprised me. As I say, I've been in this space for just over a year now, and I'm still kind of surprised that we don't have like an integrated strategy and plan for the country. It feels like we've got a number of elements of development going on, each interacting with one another, but we're not yet at the stage of saying this is where we're going to go, this is how we're going to get here, and this is all how these different components should play together in order to deliver that. So that's what we're calling for in this. So it should be a high-level geographic plan that recognises the benefits of the energy system of a more distributed offshore wind fleet, and the benefits for energy security and regional economic benefits as well. And that should be aligned with seabed leasing and an accelerated consenting process, we think, to basically give transparency and confidence to developers very early on in the process, so that they know, where the sort of areas of priority are going to be around the UK that they should be trying to target. And also in order to make sure that developers and investors are investing in port infrastructure, manufacturing and supply chain capability as well, rather than at the moment, that's kind of, once you've got your CFD, you might get your lease from the Crown Estate, but then once you've got your CFD, that's relatively late on. It's quite hard to then react, I think, in order to facilitate a rapid development of an offshore wind industry. So we think as well that financial mechanisms that support increased diversity of supply should be encouraged. So we think that the contracts for difference mechanism should continue to provide revenue stability for less established innovative technologies. And we phrased it as less established because here we're talking about diversity of the geography of supply. That's obviously applicable to other technologies as well, such as tidal. So it shouldn't necessarily just be thinking about offshore wind, but technologies in general about that kind of geographical element. And encouraging all of those different technologies to reach a competitive scale. For floating wind, we think this means allocating a sufficient strike price and retaining a separate allocation pot. We're at allocation round 5 at the moment, but certainly for the next few rounds, we think that it should be guaranteed that in order to mature in a long enough time period. And perhaps slightly differently to your last speaker, we do think that the government should consider a means of providing a geographic location signal, but we're talking about it as being distinct from locational marginal pricing, perhaps something that's within the CFD scheme that supports diversity of supply. That could be, for example, running specific allocation rounds for floating wind projects to support their development on the West Coast, or perhaps running like bespoke regional CFD rounds with a regional minima to guarantee that there's going to be a certain amount of development in a particular area. And then, of course, focusing support for floating wind, tidal, and other technologies that offer a more geographical diversity. And at the moment, I'm not sure whether you guys are aware, but there's like a call for evidence for the CFD scheme at the moment. So the government's consulting people about what they're calling non-price factors. So at the moment, the CFD scheme is very much driven by trying to drive as low a cost as possible. And they're thinking about other elements like, sustainability, supply chain development. And it could be possible at some point that they might think about an energy system value differential within that scheme in order to sort of reward schemes that are introducing the benefit of geographical diversity, if the government is to continue having a competition which is kind of geographically agnostic. At the moment, all of the projects around the country compete against one another. There's no sort of dividing into different regions. So we think that if it continues on the basis, it should at least have an element of benefit where schemes are being developed in areas that would really benefit the energy system at large. And then the final element is thinking about infrastructure investment, innovation, supply chain development. So we think that the government should continue and extend and accelerate the process of holistic network design, so that offshore and onshore network investment is in place to support offshore wind and interconnected development. And we think the government should build on the offshore transmission network review by implementing changes to the regulatory framework that will allow greater collaboration in the development of offshore transmission networks and strategic investment in shared network infrastructure. And we think it should boost support for port infrastructure development and levelling up schemes to grow the supply chain required to deploy this system at scale. that's, I've given you quite a lot of information, but I'm very happy to have a conversation around this as well as firing questions at me. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
But incidentally, that £4,000 a megawatt hour price, which is scary, I think that's the maximum, because when they set up the system,
Yeah.
it only went up to £3,999.99. So it probably could have gone a lot higher than that.
I have a feeling that they've removed that.
Yeah,
cap
they
now.
have now.
Yeah.
because-
Yeah.
Problem, wasn't it? A quick question I wanted to ask, first of all, you talked about a 20-year time window
Mm.
for wind, and then our very own Professor Sir Chris Llewellyn Smith, who's
Yeah.
looking at this large-scale storage study,
Mm.
said, oh, no, you need to go much further back than that. So the question is,
Oh, really?
looking at wind drought years, and
Yeah.
I think there's a suggestion maybe in the mid-70s or further back, there
Mm.
were periods where there was a lot less wind.
Yeah.
Whether it would be worth someone picking up one of those years to say, actually, you're still better off having diversity, or whether
Mm.
there's just less wind and you're going to have to live with the fact that
Yeah.
for a year you have less power.
Is it an entire year period of time then? that he's
That's what
talking
I've
about?
seen is certainly a significant portion of the year saying
Mm.
we might have to bank up power just for a wind drought year in the future when it
Yeah.
might come, but not knowing whether it's next year or 20 years away. So
That's really interesting. And the other thing as well is because it's sort of related to, I think, volatility as well, and the kind of the relationship between offshore wind and kind of battery storage. And it's sort of, it reminds you of that, because if we have a more volatile kind of generation profile, it means that more batteries kind of need to be ready to deal with that, which means that they are then less able to provide other services to the grid, like frequency response or just fundamentally like arbitrage as well. They obviously kind of want to fill up at cheap times and sell when it's kind of more expensive. So it feels like if you have an entire year where everyone's, I don't know, if you're anticipating this entire year, you have all of these assets where they're like, can I sell, can I not? And that's interesting and slightly scary as well. From memory, I think because we looked at perhaps like 5% capacity factor, and we found that I think in terms of the duration of that sort of sub 5% capacity factor, I don't think it changed it at all. I think for the 10%, it significantly reduced the amount of time it was below 10%, but 5%, which is probably like the Dunkelflaute, is, I don't think it really does much to that. So there's that idea there of, when you have a weather system which encapsulates all of the UK and the entire UK system has sort of low wind energy, then there's absolutely a risk there. Yeah.
we got any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have two questions. One, I'll make both. One, how does if you're aware, how does your scenarios compare to the future energy scenarios?
Yeah.
Baseline geographical distribution of their assets, because they produce some very interesting discussions about what do you do with all of this excess renewable energy? Are you gonna use it for producing hydrogen? Are you gonna use it to do direct carbon capture and storage? So I would be interested to hear if your baseline scenario is very similar to how the ESO model is on.
Yeah.
So that's one thing.
Yeah.
The other question, which is more practical, is who's the audience that has paid more attention to your study? Is it the low carbon contract companies, the crown states, is it base, or these whatever the new?
Yeah. Very good questions. So in terms of kind of the specific geographical diversity, I've not looked at where the FES, the future energy scenarios, have kind of put their assets around the UK. In terms of, because you were talking there about, I guess like production of hydrogen.
I think they simply produce very detailed accounts on, so they go, we're gonna have this amount of hours of excess renewables, and they really build very well into your own story. Like if the scenario is very similar to your scenario, your baseline scenario, then,
in terms of like the sort of east focused,
your arguments are even more valuable. Even for them to take into account and to produce scenarios. That with your views.
That's a very good point. I'll have to go and do that next. I was going to say we've run some very like rough numbers on using curtailment for hydrogen, and it doesn't really stack up. You need to have like a high capacity factor for the electrolyzer to really make it kind of a cheap form of energy. So in that sense, yeah, doesn't necessarily feel like it wouldn't be a way of kind of like making an electrolyzer sort of economically viable, but it's yeah. What was your second question as well? You were talking about who's the main interest? Yeah, yeah.
I can think of different states.
Yeah.
Maybe we should be actually doing more work.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I was really happy. This was kind of my first main project that I did at Regen, and I was delighted for it to be picked up. March was like a really good month for me because it was both the Climate Change Committee and the Offshore Wind Champion report coming out, and I mean, it was just like a reference in both. But I was like, is kind of.
And we asked you to come and speak here, but
yeah, and that as well. No, I was like, really, I think that was that March as well, was it? I think, yeah, I had a month of just being like, wow, this is because I dreamed of like what happened to me in Tidal. I was like, I want to be in a space where I'm trying to affect policy change now. So to have that in March, I was like absolutely delighted. It was like the holy trinity of happy things, basically. But yeah, but I do think the kind of the premise of the whole thing is so seductively simple. Like I think it's so intuitive to anyone to say if you kind of put wind turbines in more places, you're going to have less sort of fluctuation. You know, if the wind is very calm in the North Sea, but you've got them elsewhere, then you're probably going to have a much more constant supply of energy. I think in terms of the response I've had from it, it feels like it's giving numbers to an intuition that almost everybody has. And I think so the fact that it's been picked up by like the Climate Change Committee and TIMPIC, the Offshore Wind Champion, they're both organisations who are trying to sort of drive policy change to affect this system happening. So I feel like it's being picked up and used in a way of yeah, trying to affect change, affect policy change to ensure that like the offshore wind fleet is developed in a way that is most optimal. The other aspect is the fact that you know, Celtic Sea offshore wind development, we've had you know, there's been projections of like initially 4 gigawatt and then up to 24 gigawatt, and they've not defined how they're going to kind of get to 24 gigawatts yet. But I think there's a lot of people out there who want to see who really want to see kind of the Celtic Sea like thrive in terms of offshore wind development, as in developers, but then they don't feel that all the necessary components are in place in terms of when we're talking about supply chain development and ports and infrastructure and like grid connection, all these different things. It's not, all these things are not in place. So whilst the Crown Estate is kind of saying, oh, we think, you know, we're going to do kind of initial leasing rounds of 4 gigawatts with a view to boosting that to 24 gigawatts. That sounds great, but I think the message that we're also trying to send is this isn't a foregone conclusion. We need to make sure that we're delivering all of the necessary components to kind of deliver that in its entirety, rather than just saying like, yeah, great, 24 gigawatts sounds good, and then realizing that all those challenges are still there. I have had, that's kind of a policy side. I have had a sort of email exchange with someone who's more looking at it from a utilities perspective. I think there's some elements certainly in terms of like how we're assessing like how offshore wind assets can sorry, I'm losing my words. How offshore wind can engage in like the capacity market because they have like a down rating factor. So you can establish like a certain, you know, a peak sort of power capacity, but then you'll be down rated. I think it's something like 13 or 14% when you're trying to engage with that. And the capacity market is like a really important area for sort of like guaranteed, yeah, revenue stream for like new asset development. So if there was something in here which kind of said, oh, if we have more, if we think about the offshore wind fleet not in terms of individual wind turbines, but as an entire fleet that can sort of support the energy system, if that then raised the kind of those capacity factors and made offshore wind like a more integral part of the capacity market, it might then also drive the confidence that people have and the sort of commitment that is made to developing that offshore wind fleet.
You mentioned a bit about operation and maintenance, ports and so on. But one of the questions online from Nick, and this going back to the engineering side, is it that it's just more expensive out west because you've got deeper waters there? Yeah. Is that the primary driver and the bigger risk?
That's my understanding. Thanks for the question, Nick. Yeah, I think because we've spoken about this kind of, or mentioned it a number of times, kind of online on places like LinkedIn, there's quite a lot of discussions like within the industry around these sorts of topics, and I think Regen particularly has been sort of repeating this message about, you know, this is a very simple idea, we should be doing it. And at one point there was some controversy, I think, with someone who felt that this wasn't anything new. It's not like we're not saying anything novel as an organization. It's just the fact that it is that idea that I think the North Sea has been far easier to develop in terms of, you know, being shallower, better able to sort of deploy fixed offshore wind structures. And it's now only that we've kind of, now that floating offshore wind is a more mature technology, that we can actually start to think about doing that. So we've got the opportunity now to deploy an offshore wind that is more distributed, but fundamentally, yes, it's more challenging, will likely be more costly, I guess, than fixed offshore wind. But what we're trying to say with this is, if we're kind of like driving a market, or if we're driving competition within the CFD, which is kind of agnostic in terms of geography, then it does, you know, you will see kind of continued development on the East Coast where all of the infrastructure is in place, the ports are in place, you know, they know how to do it there. And what we're trying to say really is, yes, it's more effort to kind of get things established on the West Coast, but there is a benefit to doing that. And I think, and yeah, that's kind of the conclusion of the whole thing, is saying there is actually a real benefit to having offshore wind sort of deployed on the West Coast and North Coast of Scotland, and it's worth making that effort to get it there.
Do you think there's any chance of shared transmission connections with Ireland? Because I mean, in the North Sea, in theory, there might be a build out of some connection points disconnected from an individual development. So or is it just not close enough to the Republic, and therefore it wouldn't really play in?
That's a very good question. That's probably beyond my level of knowledge at the moment. But I mean, my first thought was kind of around like X-links. If that's coming all the way from Morocco, then going to an island seems feasible. Hi.
I think, I mean, Ireland takes electricity from the UK.
Yeah.
On a regular basis, so there is an interconnector across the Irish Sea. But I think the point about the North Sea is there's lots of interconnectors into the European market.
Yeah.
Therefore, you know, you're exporting. Yeah, so you're generating it much closer to a point of export.
Yeah.
You know, you haven't got the grid transmission losses that you would.
Yeah.
You know, west.
I guess that links to, what is it, multi-purpose interconnectors, are they, where you're kind of deploying straight from assets out to other countries? Yeah.
I've got a separate question. How long does the cable need to be before the cabling is perhaps one of the most significant investments? Because that's a lot of copper or whatever it is going into the ground. So some people say maybe that's where you generate your hydrogen, in a remote location, where actually bringing the electricity back is the bigger challenge. I don't know what that does to the economics, but
I don't know the numbers, but the thing that I hear from, or the thing that I read from characters like Paul Martin online, is just that you want to be creating your hydrogen as close to the point of use as possible, because the transportation and storage of it is so difficult. So
if it's hard enough to go out with a barge to maintain it, I think going to collect some hydrogen sounds
I mean, a neighbour of mine, he's an academic kind of looking at nuclear energy, and he had an idea which is effectively you should have electrolyzers near to nuclear power. And I mean, it goes against this idea of like curtailed energy not really being sort of making it viable to produce hydrogen. But the idea that, I guess, when we have a surge in wind power, that it's the nuclear that then sends its energy off to kind of produce hydrogen.
The positive on that.
I've need the electrolyzers next to the storage points. Because you don't want to be transporting the distance at all. And I read something about North Yorkshire sort of storage areas. You know, you want the electrolyzers above them, straight into the ground, and then you extract it when you want it and burn it there, then. But the electricity straight to the grid.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's like a sort of long duration storage.
Yeah. Well, my questions are going to be about Dunkel flags, whether you actually mapped, you know, how the distribution of wind generation around the UK would alleviate, you know, the
Dunkel
flags in mid-winter.
We've not gone, as I say, we've not gone into that much detail, but we did, one of the sort of thresholds we looked at was the 5%, and it didn't really change the the duration of that, which I would surmise would be like a Dunkelflaut event. So I think it's just that fundamental idea that if the weather system that encapsulates all of the UK kind of goes down together, then effectively, which is an interesting challenge in itself.
So what I was going to say is we'll let people offline go in a second. Just to say there is no seminar next week. We've had a wrestle over room bookings. We're going to be going from famine to feast, I think, next week. And then in the fortnight's time, we're hoping that Malcolm McCulloch's going to be talking about energy transitions, but we haven't yet bottomed out the topic with him. So just again to say thank you very much indeed, Jack, for coming to speak today.
Thank you. Thanks. Cheers.